Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be with you. I mentioned on Sunday that today, Tuesday, this morning, I had oral surgery scheduled and I had it. It was kind of intense. I had some pockets between my teeth and the bone that needed to be addressed. Peel back the gums, scrape, clean, bone graft, stitch it up. I'm in a bit of pain. I said I'm going to have that. If I can talk, I'm going to have the class. So we're going to have the class. But I'm in a bit of pain. My energy might not be what it usually is. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Bill in Missouri, Nancy, North Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, Leona in Southern Illinois, Elvis in New York, Paul in the Great Northwest. Thank you. I love the flowers and the tooth. Nina, if you're listening, could you bring me a big glass of water, please? Thanks. I think I'm going to need it. Joseph in Massachusetts, Ryan in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa, where did it skipped on me? Melissa in Great Neck, Jonathan in LA. Don't push too hard, says Elvis. Thank you, everybody. Oh, you guys, I really appreciate the sentiment. Thank you so much. Marjorie in Virginia, Ella, Michelle, Aoife, and Spencer. Welcome, everybody. Let's muscle through. You know what the worst part is? I have these problems, and you get older, these things happen. So I have the problems upper rear, lower rear on the right side. That's what we did today. Please God, it'll heal in a few weeks. And then, I don't know, next month sometime to do the upper and lower on the left. Thank you, honeys. Thank you so much. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol v'diro. So all this fun can be yours twice. Hey, let's just do it. Okay, our daf is page 41. Here in Tractate Gittin, the laws of divorce. We are picking this up at the bottom of page 40b, Mishna number 5, here in chapter 4. In the case of a slave whose master set him aside as designated repayment of a debt. Right, so right away, what? Okay, so we're in the laws of divorce, but here in chapter 4, we started by saying that the sages decreed certain things for the betterment of the world, tikkun ha'olam, which is a little bit different than repairing the world, which is tikkun olam, including was that the witnesses have to sign the get, the bill of divorce, and then we learned about some other decrees that they made for tikkun ha'olam, for example, the prosbul, which basically enabled borrowers to continue to obtain loans, when the temple was standing in ancient Israel, and all debts would be canceled in the 7th year. The legal device of the prosbul, we don't have to explain it again, we've done it a bunch of times, enabled people to get credit even with the 7th year approaching. So we also learned that there were some laws along these lines that had to do with master and slave relationships. Obviously, there hasn't been slavery in thousands of years. But, I heard our rabbi, Rav Yekusiel Kalmanson, recently say something very beautiful and important about halacha, about Jewish law. Jewish law is mandated by God from heaven through the Torah, and via the sages, so that we have a means of addressing novel situations that didn't exist in the past when they come up. That's one of the very, very important purposes of the oral tradition that we're studying here. But it's also something we should understand, that halacha, however you want to pronounce it, Jewish law, reflects the world that it's in, right? So the Messiah hasn't come yet. Mashiach hasn't come yet. We don't live in a perfect world. We live in an imperfect world. There are many aspects of this world that don't work the way they should. All kinds of situations that come up that we wish would not come up. But for every situation, there is a Jewish law that addresses it, right? Jewish law doesn't come to say, we're going to perfect the world right now. The Messiah will perfect the world when the Messiah comes. So slavery obviously was never an ideal way to live. But in the ancient world, slavery was everywhere. I mean, it was just like a fact of life in every nation on earth. Jewish law came and said, where there is slavery, it has to be done in a certain way, which provided rights for the slaves that did not exist prior to that anywhere in the world. So it's very difficult for the modern ear to hear about slavery, but understand that in a world in which slavery exists, the halacha comes to tell you how it should be addressed. So here in this Mishnah number 5, put yourself in the ancient world. It could be because slaves were property, right, and they were treated very similarly to real property. It could be that a person borrowed money and then offered as collateral the slave. So if that in that situation, how would it play out, right? So we're not dealing with the fact that slavery is evil. Right now we're dealing with the fact that in a world where slavery exists and a slave is pledged as collateral, how will that play out? So in the case of a slave whose master set him aside as designated repayment of a debt, right? So collateral for this particular debt, or let's say as a guarantee, as liened property, L-I-E-N. Or here the Greek word apoteki, which was brought into, I guess, Aramaic as well. So in the case of a slave whose master set him aside as designated repayment, apoteki, of a debt to other people from whom he borrowed money, and afterward he emancipated him, then, according to the letter of the law, the slave bears no responsibility for the debt. However, for the betterment of the world, tikkun ha'olam, his master is forced to make him a free man and writes a note for his value to pay the debt to the creditor. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says he does not write a promissory note. He only emancipates the slave. Okay, so in other words, the slave it's an unusual kind of property, as opposed to land, right? So if you borrow money and you own a field, you can say that if I don't pay back the loan, the creditor can come and seize the field. Or maybe you said you can seize the produce of the field, whatever you agreed to at the time of the loan. Well, if you used a slave, as a lien for the loan, what would happen if you freed the slave before you paid back the loan? Now, if you free a slave, he's no longer property, right? A freed slave is a person like everyone else. He has no value as property. So if you freed the slave, it's like you destroyed the collateral. So then what happens to the creditor? That's what's being asked here, right? So the owner of the slave always has the power to free the slave. But if the slave has been pledged as a lien for this loan, then what happens to the creditor? Let's get a little bit deeper into it. Here's the Gemara. The Mishnah taught the case of a slave whose master set him aside as designated repayment of a debt to other people and afterward emancipated him. So the Gemara clarifies, who emancipated him? Who emancipated him? The only one who can emancipate him is the owner of the slave. But you might think, now that a creditor has this financial interest in the slave, because if the borrower doesn't repay the loan, the creditor can step in and seize the slave as property. So maybe the creditor actually has a property interest in the slave. Does he have the power to free the slave? Probably only, you'd think, at least at this point in the discussion, only after he has seized the slave, and then it becomes the property of the creditor. Could the creditor free the slave? So it sounds like the master, right, who's also the borrower, he freed the slave. Now maybe he shouldn't have done that, since he himself designated the slave, to be the designated as the lien for the loan. Let's keep reading. Who emancipated him? Rav said his first master emancipated him, the borrower. And the Mishna is teaching like this. According to the letter of the law, the slave is not obligated to serve his second master at all. Meaning, the slave might have been pledged as an apoteki, right, as a designated repayment for that loan. I mean, designated repayment is even a little stronger than, and I will repay you with the slave. But here what they're talking about is, I will repay you with the slave if I don't repay you with money. So before he's paid back the money, he frees the slave. Now you can imagine how joyful the slave is when he obtains his freedom from his master. But then what if the creditor steps in and says, well, you never paid me back the loan, I'm taking the slave. The slave says, I'm not a slave, I was freed. So what's going to happen? According to the letter of the law, after the first master, the borrower, frees the slave is free. The slave doesn't owe payment. Maybe he was freed without having to pay for his freedom. He's not going to now have to pay for his freedom from that second master, that creditor. Why does he not have to serve the second master? He doesn't have to pay for his freedom, and he doesn't have to serve the second master. The first master freed him. Why does he not serve the second master? This law is in accordance with the statement of Rava. As Rava says, consecration of an item to the temple, becoming subject to the prohibition of leavened bread on Passover, meaning that a slave becomes a Jew basically and subject to the laws that a Jew is subject to, or at least the laws that a Canaanite slave is subject to, and then he becomes free. I think what they're saying is he becomes a Jew. All right, Rava says, consecration of an item to the temple, becoming subject to the prohibition of leavened bread on Passover, and the emancipation of a slave abrogate any lien that exists upon an item. Okay. He's not only talking about slaves. He's saying that if you have pledged, this bell as collateral for a loan, right? So I borrow money and I say, listen, if I can't pay you back the $10 I owe you, you can take the AT Daily bell. Wow, that's big value. And then, I haven't paid back the $10 yet, but before he comes and seizes my bell, I say, you know what? I'm obviously just talking blenator here. I'm going to consecrate this to the temple. It's no longer my property. Now I've consecrated. It can only be used for the holy purposes of the upkeep in the temple. The guy that lent me the $10, he can't come and take the bell. The bell is no longer available for that because it's been consecrated. Becoming subject to the prohibition of leavened bread. What does this mean? When a prohibition against deriving benefit from an item takes effect with regard to a liened item, for example, leavened bread on Passover, the lien is abrogated. In other words, if I had used bread, maybe I had a closet full of loaves of bread, and I was going to use them to secure a loan, and say, if I don't pay you back the money, you can take my closet full of bread. But then, we're both Jews, and then Passover starts. Neither one of us can benefit, not just not eat it. We can't even benefit from leavened bread. So he's not going to be able to use that bread as payment of the loan. Therefore, in the case of our Mishnah, the slave should be a free man after his master emancipates him, and the creditor may not take possession of him. However, for tikkun ha'olam, lest the creditor will find the slave in the market and will say to him, "You are my slave. When I lent money to your master, he pledged you as the collateral, and here you are. I'm taking you." And the creditor says, "I don't know that you say your master freed you. I never heard about that." Lest that situation happen, the court forces his second master, meaning the creditor, to make him a free man. And the slave writes a promissory note for his value that he owes to the second creditor, right? If I owe that guy money and I use my slave as collateral and then I freed the slave, I destroyed the collateral. I shouldn't have done that. But because of this human interest that, I destroyed the collateral by freeing the slave, we're not going to make the slave, we're not going to say that I didn't free him. I did free him. Now, the creditor might try to seize the slave anyway. And that's why the court is going to step in and say to the creditor, you don't have rights in this slave. In fact, just in case there's a doubt, you also declare that he's free. And we're going to work it out that the guy who borrowed money from you he still owes you the money. He's not off the hook. And he's going to have to repay you, but it's not going to be via the slave. Right, Rabban. Now, the rabbi said, but the slave does owe he shouldn't have been freed. He got free for free, as it were. But he's going to owe his value to the second master. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, no. He doesn't owe anything to the second master. When I freed him, he became free, and he doesn't owe his value to anyone. And that is the law. The Gemara explains, with regard to what law do the rabbis and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagree? They disagree with regard to the law in the case of one who causes damage to his friend's lien. As one sage, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, holds that one who causes damage to his friend's lien is liable to pay for the damage, although the liened object itself does not belong to his friend. Therefore, in the case of the Mishna, the one who emancipated the slave is required to write a promissory note for his value. And one sage, the first Tana, holds that he is exempt. Consequently, it is the slave who is required to write a promissory note for his value. But the law follows Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And on this idea of if one sells a promissory note to his friend and then he forgives the debt, right? If Joe owes me $10, I'm leaving town. So I sell the note, which is worth $10. Once Joe repays it, I sell it to Bob. So and there's not a guarantee that Joe's going to repay it. So I sell it to Bob for $9, right? Bob, he's buying a note for $9. When Joe pays it back, it's going to be worth $10. Good deal for Bob. What if after I sell the note to Bob and Bob's holding the note, I go crazy and I take that piece of paper and burn it up? I already got paid, right? But that note is not just the evidence, it's the instrument by which Bob will get paid by Joe. So if I burn that up, out of spite or negligence or whatever, I've destroyed Bob's $10 note. I now owe him $10. It is also stated that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis disagree with regard to that issue when discussing one who causes damage to his friend's lien. We have arrived at the dispute between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis, which supports the above analysis. But Ula said another explanation of the dispute in our Mishnah. And by the way, we're well into page 41a now. Ula explained it differently. Who emancipated the slave? Says Ula, the second master, the creditor who seized the slave. He freed him. But even before he seized him. And the Mishnah should be explained like this. According to the letter of the law, the slave is not at all obligated in mitzvahs as a result of his emancipation because the creditor did not have the authority to emancipate him. if the creditor frees the slave before he seized him, right? Like what did he do? He lent me, $1,000, and I said, if I can't pay you back the $1,000, you get my slave. He says, okay, that's the deal. And then he stands up and says, you know what? I don't think people should be slaves. Your slave is free by virtue of the authority that I have because I'm your creditor and you pledged the slave as for security. Can he do that? No, he can't do that. That's what Ula is saying. He can't do that. He can't free my slave because the slave is still my slave. However, for the betterment of the world, for Tikkun Haolam, since a rumor has spread about the slave that he became free as a result of this invalid emancipation that the creditor spoke, so the first master, the borrower, is forced to make his slave a free man. And the slave writes a promissory note for his value to be paid to his original master, who was forced to emancipate his slave without receiving compensation. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the slave does not write a promissory note for his value. Rather, the one who emancipates, the creditor, writes a promissory note and pays the original master. There's a totally different understanding of what happened in our Mishnah. It's how Ula explains it, but it's not how the majority explains it. The Gemara explains, with regard to what principle do they disagree? They disagree with regard to the damage that is not evident, i.e., in a case where the value of an item was lowered due to a change that occurred that is not noticeable in the physical properties of that item. One sage, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, holds that damage that is not evident is termed damage. Consequently, since the master is forced to emancipate his slave as a result of the action of the creditor, it is viewed as if the creditor has damaged the item of the master. And one sage, the other sage, the first Tana, holds that damage that is not evident is not termed damage, and the creditor is not liable to pay. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that Ula did not say an explanation in accordance with the explanation of Rav with regard to the proper understanding of our Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, Ula could have said to you, do you call the second person his master? Which is the term employed in the Mishnah to describe the one who emancipated the slave. The creditor was never, in fact, the master of the slave, as the slave was only lien to him. So why didn't Rav explain it the way Ula explained it? Well, Rav could have said to you, do you call the second person the one who emancipates? The second person has no right to emancipate the slave because he never became the owner of the slave. In light of my oral surgery, I'm just going to skip a few paragraphs. I'm really having trouble speaking. Okay, Mishnah number 6. Here toward the bottom of page 41a. In the case of one who is a half slave and half free, because only one of his two owners emancipated him, he serves his master one day and serves himself one day. This is the statement of Beis Hillel, right? So imagine two partners own a slave. One of them says, I no longer believe in slavery. I free my slave. The other partner doesn't say that. So now the slave is half free and half owned by one of the original partners. So the original ruling on what to do in that situation was that, okay, so on Monday, the slave works for his master. On Tuesday, the slave works for himself. He can earn a living. On Wednesday, he works for his master. On Thursday, he works for himself. And in this way, he can eventually pay off the master who still owns half of him and become fully free. But that is not the law. Beis Shammai say, through such an arrangement, you have remedied his master, as his master loses nothing through this. The one who still owns half the slave continues to get half of the slave's labor. However, you have not remedied the slave himself, as the slave himself remains in an unsustainable situation. It is not possible for him to marry a maidservant because he is already a half-free man. He can't marry a female slave because he's half-free. And it is prohibited for a free man to marry a female slave. It is also not possible for him to marry a free woman because he is half-slave. If you say he should be idle and not marry, idle meaning not that he shouldn't work, but that he shouldn't marry, But isn't it true that the world was created only for procreation? As it is stated, he, meaning God, did not create it to be a waste. He formed it to be inhabited. And this is the source, along with be fruitful and multiply, for the law that men are obligated to reproduce. Interestingly, women are not obligated to have children because childbirth, especially in the ancient world, was dangerous. So if a woman didn't want to have children, she's not obligated to have children. But a man is obligated to have children. According to Beis Hillel, that obligation does not cease until he has fathered a boy and a girl. According to Beis Shammai, that obligation doesn't cease until that man has fathered 2 boys. Now, of course, some people, because of situations in their life, are unable to have children. That's fine. But according to the law, if you should try, you should try to have children if possible. Rather, for the betterment of the world. So therefore, because this male slave, who is now half free and half slave, is not going to be able to marry in that situation, so for tikkun ha'olam, his master, the remaining master, is forced to make him a free man. And the slave writes a promissory note accepting his responsibility to pay half his value to his master. And Beis Hillel ultimately retracted their opinion to rule in accordance with the statement of Beis Shammai that a half slave must be set free. And that's Mishnah number 6. We're on 41b now. The sages taught, with regard to a master who emancipates only half of his slave. Now, this is different. Not a slave has 2 masters and one of them frees his half. But a slave is fully owned by one master and the master says, you are now half free. The master has not said anything. One who fully owns a slave either frees him or doesn't. No halvesies. The sages taught, with regard to a master who emancipates only half of his slave, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says he has acquired himself, i.e. the transaction is complete and half of the slave is emancipated. But the rabbis say no. He has not acquired himself. Nothing has happened. You can say that the master could say to him, you're halfway toward becoming free. But he hasn't become half free and half slave like a slave would if he had 2 masters and one of them freed him. Rabbah said the dispute between Rebbe and the sages, their dispute pertains only to a case where the master emancipated him with a bill of manumission, as Rebbe holds, in the context of a Jewish man who engages in sexual intercourse with a female slave who had been designated to cohabit with a Hebrew slave. The Torah writes that neither the Jewish man nor this female slave is liable to receive the death penalty, though the man is liable to bring a guilt offering. If the woman had been emancipated, she would be a regular married woman, and they would incur the death penalty for their act of intercourse. In describing the woman in that case, the Torah writes, and not at all redeemed, nor was freedom given to her. Leviticus 19:20, and this is referring to 2 methods of emancipating a slave. Redemption via money, right, where somebody purchases the slave or the slave purchases himself. And emancipation via a bill of manumission, when the master just decides to free the slave. Right, so redemption through money is in the phrase, and not at all redeemed, and redemption via bill of manumission is referred to in the phrase, nor was freedom given to her. Now the verse juxtaposes the freeing of a slave via a bill of manumission to the freeing of a slave via payment of money, to teach that just as with money, the slave can free either all of him or half of him. For if he were to pay half of his value, the master, he would be half redeemed. So too, by receiving a bill of manumission, either all of him or half of him can be emancipated. That's Rebbe's argument. But the rabbis derive their opinion that a slave cannot acquire half of his freedom via a bill of manumission given by the master from a verbal analogy of the word her written in this verse, nor was freedom given to her, and the word her written with regard to a man who divorces a woman, and he writes her a scroll of severance, the law of the get. Just as in the case of a woman, one is not able to divorce half of his wife. You can't say you're half divorced and half married. Either you're married or you're divorced, one or the other. You can't tell her that you're now half divorced. So just as in the case of a woman, one is not able to half divorce her, so too one is not able to half emancipate a slave with a bill of manumission. However, with regard to a slave who frees himself by giving money, everyone agrees that the slave acquires half of himself, and a female slave would also be partially redeemed, but not fully redeemed. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that they disagree about this. I'm going to skip a few paragraphs. My jaws, my gums and teeth, it's not so good. Let me skip a few paragraphs. Okay. The Gemara raises an objection against Rav Yosef's statement based on what was taught in a Baraisa. With regard to one who emancipates half of his slave with a bill of manumission, right, which Rebbe says you can do, but the rabbis say you can't. Rebbe says he has acquired himself, and the rabbis say he has not acquired himself. And the Gemara concludes this is a refutation of Rav Yosef. So the Gemara suggests, in this Baraisa, they disagree in a case where the slave is half emancipated via a bill of manumission, where the master just says, I free half of you. And Rebbe says, okay, the slave is half free. And the rabbis say you can't do that. However, they do not explicitly disagree in a case where the slave is half redeemed with money, where he purchases half of his freedom. So shall we say this is a conclusive refutation of the statement of Rav Yosef with regard to two aspects. First, as above, Rebbe holds that he is half freed with a bill of manumission. Second, according to his statement, the dispute pertains to redeeming with money. Yet the Baraisa gives no indication that the rabbis would hold that the slave can be half redeemed with money. And the Gemara says, no, Rav Yosef could have said to you, they disagree with regard to emancipation via bill of manumission, and the same is true that they would disagree with regard to redeeming with money. And this that they explicitly disagree with regard to emancipation via bill of manumission is to convey to you the far-reaching nature of Rebbe, that a slave can be half-freed even by receiving a bill of manumission for half of his freedom, and certainly through payment of money. And the Gemara asks, and let them disagree with regard to redeeming with money, and to convey to you the far-reaching nature of the opinion of the rabbis, that they hold he cannot be half-freed even through redemption with money. And the Gemara responds, it is preferable to the Tana of the Mishna to emphasize the power of leniency, and therefore the dispute is presented as it is. I'm going to go to questions now, and I'm just going to explain what he means here by the power of leniency. As they're discussing this dispute over, the bottom line is that the slave does not become half free through a bill of manumission. Can the slave become half free by purchasing half of his freedom? I'm not sure. But what we saw right away in our Mishnah is if there's two masters and one master frees his half of the slave, then the other master is forced to free his half of the slave, but he didn't necessarily have to give away the property. The slave will have to owe the second master his own value. But right now, the slave goes free. In the course of this discussion, comes up this concept of the power of leniency. And what that means is, when we encounter a doubt, right? either a factual doubt or in this case, a doubt with regard to what is the law. We're not sure what the law is. So when we're not sure what the law is, the natural thing to do is to rule stringently. And in cases of Torah law, when there's doubt, we always rule stringently. In cases of rabbinic decree, when there's a doubt, we rule leniently. Okay, and what the commentators say here, what the Koren Talmud says, which is Rav Steinsaltz, is that it's much more difficult to be lenient. Right? It's easy to rule stringently when there's a doubt. It takes a great Rav, a great rabbi, a great teacher, a great interpreter to rule with confidence that the lenient view should hold. So when we encounter a leniency with respect to Torah law, it means that, either the majority or a great Rav who the majority will listen to and heed and follow has ruled, right? Whereas we're unsure what the ruling is, where the law lies, with a matter of when it's a matter of Torah law, we're going to end up with a stringency, right? So when you have a stringency, we're not sure whether the law got settled. It might be that there's a doubt. But when we have a leniency, it means that the matter is settled because, it's not easy to arrive at a leniency. If they arrived at a leniency, it's because the law was settled in that way, and that's the power of a leniency. Okay, we're going to knock off there. My mouth is just killing me. If you're joining late, I had oral surgery this morning. I said I was going to teach if I can talk. That was a little bit ambitious. So let me just take 2 questions. Paula says, stop now. You're hard to watch in pain. I'll just take 1 question. Elvis, my big picture observation. We recently had a discussion, a Torah study of slavery laws under Judaic law versus other societies at the time. I'm once again struck by the systematic attempt to regulate this institution to minimize injustices and abuses being visited upon the slave. This is so unique in ancient times. Just so. I'm done. Please, God, by tomorrow, I hope that the pain will have subsided as well as the swelling, and I'll be able to teach. If that's not the case, we'll just put an announcement on the Facebook page. But I'm hopeful that by tomorrow I'll be better. At least, better enough that I can teach. I'm sorry, guys. Please forgive me.